The African Development Bank Group is holding its annual general meeting here in Nairobi. This meeting is coming at a critical time when there is a call for transformation of the African continent as well as reforming the global financial architecture. Joining us on this week's episode of Inside Government, we're talking to the Cabinet Secretary, National Treasury and Economic Planning, Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, who is also the chairperson of the African Development Bank Group governors. He's the chair of the group governors. And so he's joining us to explain to us why this meeting is important, not only to Kenya, but to Africa, what we should expect and what is the way forward. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Prof. Why is this meeting important to us as a nation and as Africa?
Thank you very much. And let me say that this is the African Development Bank Group, and Kenya is hosting. And so it means that the governor of the hosting country becomes the chair of the boards of governors. This is the 59th annual meeting. So it means that we are lucky because we have to apply to host, we are lucky to host it. But the most important thing is that it has the theme, Africa's transformation, just like you said, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. That is a topic we can actually debate the whole day. But we can start in small steps. First, Africa's transformation is very, very critical. Why? Let me state maybe three factors. We have come from a very, very devastating consequences of negative shocks. We started with the COVID. We went into supply constraints because of the Ukrainian war. We came to the global dollar shortage. Then a series of negative climate shocks. We started with a drought we haven't seen for the last 40 years. Then it was followed by El Nino. And now we have a flooding season that is even more than El Nino. So the economy is unwinding from layers and layers of negative shocks. And when there are layers and layers of negative shocks, we are actually talking about permanent effects. They are creating a permanent effect. One of the things I could stress here, maybe for purposes of clarity, is that we noticed, for example, the drought. We lost close to 2.4 million heads of cattle. It means these are assets of the poor people in ASAL regions. But more importantly for me, especially where I have come from, we noticed that it actually reversed 20 years of poverty, of fighting poverty, eradicating poverty, and also massively increased inequality, both at household level and regional level. Just imagine.
20 years.
20 years. It reversed the efforts of this country of 20 years trying to eradicate poverty and fighting inequality. And that is very, very critical. It's a very important point. From my earlier life, I can say that we had covered the frontier work. We showed that strong growth affects or reduces poverty significantly. But once it is supplemented by targeted social protection programs like the one we have in Kenya, the social transfers we started during COVID, it actually reduces inequality in the long term. Now, it means now I'm coming to the second point. How do we ignite that growth? That is where transformation becomes very important. It resonates very well with the bottom-up economic transformation agenda. First, bottom-up. Why? Because most people have been left behind, and because of these layers and layers. Two, since they have been left behind, why have they been left behind? I usually provide several factors, but let me talk about two. One of them is capacity of the human capital development itself, the capacity. Look at what has happened. Our education system. Can we access education? It's quality of education. But what about health? Health infrastructure was devoured and tested to the limit by COVID. So essentially, we have so many problems that are coming through. So in a sense, some people have been has sunk in that level because you can go into labor markets, how they function, nutrition outcome. That's one component. The other component is collapse of markets. When institutions fail, markets collapse. I usually refer people to, let's look at the coffee subsector, where the market collapsed. See the poverty that affected people with heavy investment they had made in coffee. Look at the sugar sector. Heavy investment, but the market has collapsed. So what happens is that if the markets are not functioning, the poor cannot access that market. They cannot get returns from their own production. Everything becomes a mess. That recognition that bottom-up is very, very important is because we need to come back and rectify the situation. So it needs a series of policy reforms, interventions, and programs to alleviate that. The third one is the reform of the global financial architecture. You have seen how we have suffered with the Eurobond. I don't even need to tell a story. The Eurobond, the risk profiling. And then we say, maybe what we really need is to change the global financial architecture using the multilateral development banks. And African Development Bank is one of them. What do we want to do? We want to look at them in terms of capacity to deal with the current issues. Speed. That is, when there is a crisis, they support with speed, not tied to programs. 3, fit for purpose, because then they have to come up with programs that are fitting the countries that are in demand. And the third one, scale of resources. Scale of resources because they have a AAA rating and they can leverage using their AAA rating to raise more resources than they can raise than an individual country. So the combination of that is what everybody is talking about in terms of the global financial architecture. But I think even in African countries, the quantum of resources is one point of it. The cost of resources is the other. But they are self-reinforcing, isn't it? But then what spoils the party is the risk profiling so that you don't go to the market. And you see Kenya has gone into the international capital markets. But you can see what has happened. You've seen what has happened when we were dealing with the Eurobond. Even when we decided that let's refinance from the market to reduce the risk, that is the perceived risk that is coming up. So in the end, it is quantum, and that quantum can define the scale because of the problems that are facing. In most of my talks in the recent months, I talk about unwinding from layers and layers of multiple shocks. Okay? For example, you find that the debt situation in African countries has become quite problematic. It's a whole spectrum of historical challenges that come in, and you find yourself with no fiscal space, so you have to borrow. And then because of risk profile, you have to borrow, in most of the time, you borrow in short-term instruments, like the bills, the 91, for example, in Kenya, we have 91 and 182 and 365 treasury bills. They were supposed to be for cash management. But because everybody wants, the private sector would like to play short, they don't want a long term, especially when they see the risks around, then they prefer those short term. So it means that maturities are hitting you very fast. So you can see that the layers and layers of several problems that we actually have to overcome. That is very, very critical. And that is why the theme of the African Development Bank Group is very timely. We are going to have, maybe before we go out, we are going to have ministers of finance from the African country, because all the countries in Africa are members. But we are also going to have other governors coming from other regions who are shareholders of, because the annual meeting is also an AGM. So it means that all the governors
governors of central banks?
No. Governors of the African Development Bank Group are ministers of finance. Yeah. So we are going to have all ministers of finance in this country for a whole week. There will be other governors coming from other regions because there are other shareholders of the African Development Bank from other countries, even Western countries, the US, Britain, Germany. You'll find all of them here, okay? That's one thing. So coming to talk about these issues in African soil is very, very important. Coming to talk about these issues at the present when we are suffering from the floods we are seeing is very, very important. So that when we now come back to the main subject matter of climate change and Africa's transformation, or investing in adaptation, whichever way you start, then it becomes very relevant. It is a very timely topic, theme, but also timely because of who will be addressing it. We are going to be dealing with the bank that is owned by African countries, the bank that looks at African interest. It's a multilateral bank, but we'll be asking the bank, how can you raise the scale of resources to lead to the economic transformation? Before I leave that, economic transformation depends on capital accumulation. When we talk about economic transformation, we are actually saying there is a particular threshold of capital accumulation, that is savings, that ignites transformation. So when we talk about transformation, we can start from institutional transformation, economic transformation, and even our own social transformation, because we cannot wake up from the layers and layers of negative shocks that have hit us. They have created a structural effect without having a transformation. That's the point I wanted to emphasize, because the word Africa's transformation becomes well contextualized.
And I like the fact that you're bringing in the issue of debt. And when you look at Africa, it has a debt of almost 700 billion US dollars, and paying an interest of almost 75 billion US dollars every year. Are we likely also to have a conversation on how to realign our borrowing trends with market rates?
Markets are expensive. If you are looking for resources for development, that is creating public goods, isn't it? You need concessional, not market rates. Let me just give you an example. Let's say a good example is Thika Superhighway, isn't it? How long did it take to complete that road? A couple of years, isn't it?
4 years, actually.
4 years. If you borrowed at market rates, you'll be servicing the debt. But how do you get returns to pay for that? If it was private sector, you'd toll the road, isn't it? But it's not tolled. So in a sense, it's going to be very difficult for you to roll out public goods using private capital, because private capital is going to be very expensive. It's going to be difficult. But you see, the desperation is such that you want to deliver that public good, and the new concept is to say, if you can't deliver the public good, maybe you toll it, and it becomes a combination, because the private sector can provide it, but now at a cost. So let me go back to the issue of debt. The debt accumulation has come in because you're buffeted by so many shocks and you have no fiscal space. You have to accumulate debt. Okay? So we have now to ask ourselves, how can you try to get out of that trap? And that is where we are coming back to investing in adaptation to climate change, because most of the shocks have been climate change. Other shocks that are transitory, although they have been persistent, are supply shock constraints. Now, how do you solve the debt situation? The Kenya government itself started with a fiscal consolidation path. It means that you can actually look at how you can minimize expenditure, but here it becomes very, very painful, because minimizing expenditure means cutting on development cost and social cost, recurrent cost. But it is a critical point to make, or a critical path to take, so that you have to create fiscal space. You have to get into a very painful path of fiscal consolidation. The easiest route is actually liability management. Liability management is actually saying, look, you can resolve your debt problem by actually taking concessional borrowing, or taking concessional loans, or even borrowing at concessional rates. First, to provide some development funding, that is, for example, roads, but at the same time, resolve the debts that are, for example, expensive debts. Okay? So commercial debt is very expensive, but you need concessional funding, and that is what the African Development Bank is advocating when you talk about this transformation, or even the reform of the global financial architecture, so that we get concessional funding that can allow you to retire the expensive debt. That is in the short term. In the long term, you want concessional funding at multilateral level and bilateral level that allows you to roll out public investment in public goods that gives you the momentum for growth. Because if you don't invest in the development, development spending, or the development spending or investment in development activities allows you to improve or raise the capacity for future growth. So when you constrain development spending, it means that you are constraining the future capacity for growth. So it's a catch-22. You have to allocate development spending. You can only get that development spending in a concessional way, because development spending is long-term. Okay? We want to roll out, like, for example, we have stored roads. We need to get concessional funding to bring those roads up, because we are accumulating a lot of cost having stored roads. You want to roll out, let's say, TVET schools, because we want to raise our youth, because we have to create jobs for our youth. So there are so many things that you have to do. So development spending laces capacity for future growth.
You know, President William Ruto has been at the forefront of calling for the reforming of the global financial architecture. But when you look at Africa, I mean, we don't access multilateral lenders as a group. We do it individually as countries, I mean, as Kenya, as South Africa, as Egypt. So then how do we then coalesce together as a continent and call for the reforming of the global financial architecture?
I think it's going to be difficult to approach multilateral lending as a group. What multilateral lending has done is actually to come up with program lendings, program lending, for example. For example, the World Bank has DPO. DPO is Development Policy Operations. In it, you can decide what you want to be in. It's going to be, let me move to one extreme. One extreme is to say that if countries are having regional public goods to be financed, then they can approach multilaterals as a group. But if it is your own individual program, what you'd like to fight for is a commonality of the programs that can be rolled out, isn't it? The programs. For example, the African Development Bank, together with the World Bank, they have this, policy reform program and project financing. That allows you flexibility in terms of what you can create inside there. But the whole issue of what His Excellency is talking about in global financial architecture is what I started by saying. We want, first of all, why are we having problems in the international capital markets? It's cost, isn't it? So it means that we need to have cost consideration when we talk about multilateral lending. That is not an issue. What we have an issue is the scale. Okay? Scale means the quantum of resources. Those multilateral lendings have been buffeted by these shocks so that their capacity has been ruined. The second one is restructure products that are fit for purpose, so that country A is not the same as country B. Right now, for example, we are suffering from these floods, isn't it? We suffered from El Nino not long ago, and before that we suffered from drought and extreme. So in a sense, if we wanted to structure products for Kenya, it's going to be different from products, for example, Uganda is not suffering from the same. By the way, Right now, the floods are only affecting Tanzania and Kenya, isn't it? But if you go south, Mozambique and South Africa and a bit of Madagascar, you're going to find the same problem. But Uganda may be suffering from a totally different issue, isn't it? And if you go further, you find... So it is going to be difficult to say countries should go and negotiate as a group. Countries should negotiate programs that are fit for purpose, fit for themselves, in terms of what is the constraint today, okay? So today is our constraint today is how do we save lives with the floods? And then how do we, after the floods, invest in how we can adapt to this kind of condition? His Excellency, the Deputy President, said that a very advanced level of forecasting weather have shown that in the next 7 years, we are going to have more floods than even droughts. Okay? You go now to centers of excellence forecasting weather patterns. So what does it say? It says that you need to safeguard yourself in terms of what you need to do. Because in every crisis, you can take an advantage. But because we don't have resources, do we have an institution fit for purpose to tell them, this is what we have to do to safeguard ourselves? That's one component of global financial architecture. I've talked about the timing, speed. The next one is scale. The third one is cost. And the fourth one is fit for purpose. You can see the combination of all those. So that's what we're saying. But I forgot to tell you, before I joined this job, I think I had done some work on debt. I edited one of the volumes of one of maybe journals in the Oxford. Perhaps you may look for it. And I talked about growing with debt in African countries. Growing with debt in African countries. It's actually just like a reflection of the Marshall Plan. In the Marshall Plan, it was providing debt to European countries to reconstruct after the World War II, isn't it? So growing with debt is a developmental subject matter. Development economics has accommodated this as a very, very important component. That's why I coined the title of that special issue of a Journal of African Economists in Oxford as Growing with Debt in African Economies. I turned the whole thing of looking at debt as a negative thing to looking at debt as one that is going to create capital for the future. Invest. And we need right now, for us, the most tight thing for now is actually to invest in adaptation because of environmental changes. We need to invest heavily in ecological restoration. That is where, because we have to solve this problem. The climatic condition, if we don't solve it now, it means it's going to get worse. But it is not getting better. It's going to be worse.
It's likely to get catastrophic.
Yeah, it is be catastrophic. So it means now we have now to start investing in adaptation.
The conversation now is around sustainable financing of sustainable projects.
Yes.
And this is a conversation that is going to take place. That's going to take place during the AGM.
Yes.
What do we expect out of this?
We need to come up with streams of, as you say, sustainability of those investment in adaptation. Different countries have different strands of what can bring out development. Let's talk about ours, for example. We've started with bottom-up economic transformation agenda, isn't it? Now, when we see floods, what are you going to look at? I've argued in so many places that this is the time to map out where are the waterways, so that in future we know that don't construct your building on the waterways, because water will find its place. There was a viral from Tanzania warning that it is not flooding, it is you who constructed where the waterways are. But for me, that is, of course, a good way to look at it. But the most important thing for me is that all that water will go to the ocean. Yes, yet it has passed in lowlands, in ridgelands. We need to look at where are the waterways, how can we reconstruct the dams. Now, once we reconstruct the dams, we can now start smart agriculture. Smart agriculture, because once we have the dams, downstream, we can actually reclaim agricultural work, smart agriculture, where we can even create aggregators for different types of products. That's one component of investing in adaptation, so that we control that. The second one is we have to now start asking ourselves in terms of our own construction, like roads, for example. We have to now change technology. Third, we have to look at ways where we can actually bring employment to our youths, because this is where we are really affected. Because even if you are buffeted by climate change and you have no resources, there's nothing much you can do, isn't it? You still find people cutting trees to burn charcoal. But we have to give them some livelihood. And that is why, for example, affordable housing is becoming important, because it allows you to get some income. And you can now invest when you have incomes. So in a way, it is diversity. Planting trees is one aspect of ecological restoration. We have to work on it, should I say, selfishly defend it and move with it in total speed.
The other aspect of this meeting is it's also going to look inwardly and outwardly the operations of the African Development Bank. Mm-hmm. And we are going to reimagine the next 60 years. How do we expect this conversation to go?
Let me say that different models of institutional development are becoming very, very important. We are seeing institutions like the African Development Bank metamorphosing to become a global leader in terms of development discourse. It is a source of knowledge. That's one aspect, because one of the things about knowledge base is how we actually can recreate the knowledge base. It's a source of policy advice. Some years ago, I was asked once when we were buffeted by COVID in 2021, somebody asked me, how do we push for economic recovery in Africa? And this is going to be a topical issue in the African Development Bank. Because economic recovery, we have to start with recovery, so that we can now invest and accelerate the momentum for transformation. And I argued, first, human capital development. Most people feel that that is a phrase that is too big to consume, but look at our education, look at our health, look at our labor markets, and look at nutrition. Nutrition. Whichever way you start, you'll find that everything comes together. I was talking the other day to one of my colleagues here and said that, why are we being condemned, our kids finishing Form 4, we are all condemned to a D. And I asked, I need to get data and find out why are we find most of the people you find in the rural areas who are desperate actually attained a D. Why is the attainment so low? From my previous life, I had worked on 7 countries in Africa on education system. And they showed that it was not only bad, but getting worse. And you take a sample of students who in a particular category. So it means that we have to go back. What is the outcome? The outcome is actually we have to go back to the nutrition. Why nutrition is important? There is a friend of mine, he has come to this office. He's got Nobel Prize in 2019. And he was studying children feeding program in Western Kenya in experimental design way, what you call the randomized control experiments. It showed that actually nutrition is very, very critical. That's why I combine those 4. Why is it important that I talk about human capital development? Because you find that our failure in our institutions is because of the leadership institutions, isn't it? You have to get people who lead the institutions. Something I wrote about in 2017. At that time I was talking about digitization and state capacity. My argument is that institutions can fail. Institutions have 2 important components that they have to observe. The first of all is to uphold the legal framework. And the second thing is to define the incentive structure, the incentive mechanism. A combination of appropriate rules of the game or legal framework and the incentives, the reward system, is going to encourage prudent behavior in the marketplace. Markets will work. That's why I wanted to use that to go. If institutions fail, policy fails, isn't it? Now, let's go to the next one, markets. Where markets have failed, poverty has really struck. I gave examples. But what I'm saying, for example, in our smallholder economy, you can say that when I'm looking at the markets there, downstream, I'm going to increase production and productivity. By the way, when we talk about production, it's increasing production, isn't it? When we talk about productivity, we are talking about profits, isn't it? Because you have, you know, productivity is the unit cost is lowering. So it means that the market is performing, production and productivity is increasing, wealth is emerging. So that's market. The final one I like talking about is domestic resource mobilization. We have to reform, it's a whole family of things. We have to reform our tax system. Everybody complained about high taxes. Then you ask someone, which taxes? We can't pinpoint. By the way, I'm honest here. And I can quickly ask which taxes, and nobody could tell which taxes. But it's because it got into their head, because high prices are not coming because of high taxes, it is inflation. But that is not what they were looking for. It is because of layers and layers of negative shocks. Poverty has hit us, we are at the bottom. So we are actually blaming taxes, but actually it is our poverty that has increased. We have been pushed further down. That is why we want to come back and reform the whole age of tax instruments, the whole age of how we collect taxes, the whole domestic resource mobilization, even instruments that we use to finance. PPP has become very, very important. I like PPP because I can talk about it until cows come home. Why? Private sector has the capacity. They don't have budget constraints like governments. They have no constraints with buying any technology is available, the frontier of technology. And finally, they are very, very sensitive to time.
As we wind up this interview, what is your message to the people, both in Kenya and outside this country, who are watching this broadcast?
The clear message is that we have to drive Africa's transformation. You know, development has to be engineered with new ideas. And those new ideas are the ones that are going to bring the change we are looking for. But for us to get that transformation, we have to resolve the constraints that are hitting us constantly. And those constraints, we know them. Some of them are nature-driven, others are institutional weaknesses, and others are resource availability, which actually is also part of the institutional weaknesses. You can have resources, but if you don't have ideas in terms of transformation, your transformation will fail. But let's focus on Kenya and say we have a very important idea in terms of transformation, bottom-up economic transformation agenda. Bottom-up economic transformation is an agenda, not a model. It means that you don't have to look at, oh, did this block come in or did this block not come in? It recognizes that if you have to bring those people who have been left behind, you have to do so many things. And those are the things I have outlined. So actually, we can go with the idea that we need an economic transformation, or let's say we need a transformation. It is a combination of both socio-political and economic, okay? But we need to come back and say, what do our multilateral institutions like African Development Bank do to help? They have also to change their model. They have to change their configuration of how they can help. African Development Bank has been on the forefront of even saying we need even SDR, resource port, that can help African countries to move away from the kind of limitations they have held, they have been pushed. Lack of resources or lack of the investment in adaptation, for example, in climate change, it means that we cannot get out of that upheaval, isn't it? We cannot grow from that upheaval. So we have to move in that direction. And that is why we are saying part of that transformation is institutional, part of that transformation is also in heavy investment in adaptation. Part of that transformation is actually reforming the architecture, because resources are scarce, but the available resources are also expensive. Scarcity value is always inhibiting, isn't it? Scarcity value is inhibiting, but how do we overcome that? We can use our multilateral institutions to leverage their AAA rating to provide scale of resources, speed in terms of when they are needed, and applicability. On one side, we have to strengthen our institutions to make sure that we deliver, because the institutional failure problem leads also to policy failure problem. That is how markets have failed, and then everybody fails. It is a transformation, and you can look at it from different dimensions, and it is not an academic debate, by the way. You know, most people will dismiss it and say it's an economic debate. Just look at even your own self. Unless you do A, B, C, D, you cannot transform. We need to make sure that we are all reading on the same page, and that is where we are. In Kenya, we wake up and criticize virtually everything that you see. But if you ask a direct question, everybody fables. But if you say, let's construct something that we all can understand, admire, and emulate those who have succeeded, we can do that. And you find so many examples that come up, and we can use them. Thank you very much.
Very good. Well, we've been talking to the Cabinet Secretary in charge of National Treasury and Economic Planning. He's also the chairperson of the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank, so he's going to be the host of the AGM of African Development Bank, which is happening at Kenyatta International Convention Center. And Kenya Broadcasting Corporation is going to be the official broadcaster of this event. We'll keep on having this kind of conversation. You have been watching Inside Government. My name is O'Brien Kimani. Thank you for your time.